So good morning, everybody. This is David. It's just right at 11 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. It looks like the login rate's slowing down. I want to welcome everybody to this month's science communication webinar in the Understanding Our Wildlife series. So with that, our presenter this morning is Chris Cray. He is our Assistant Chief for the Game and Fur Bearer programs in the Wildlife Management Division. And Chris's presentation is wild turkey gobbling chronology using new technology to answer age-old questions. And so with that, Chris, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, hello everybody. David, if you could just confirm for me that I'm still pretty good on the sound, is that right?
Yeah, you sound fine to me, and I can see your title slide just fine.
Okay, and can you see my mouse on the screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'll try to not play with that, but there are a couple slides I might point some stuff out with. So appreciate everybody's time today to hear about what I think is some pretty exciting stuff. As David said, I am the assistant chief that leads the Game and Fur Bearer program, but for a number of years, I worked within that program as our upland game bird biologist. And really the project that we're talking about today came from my time as the upland game bird biologist. And, pretty daggone exciting stuff in my mind. Turkeys are a fantastic big game animal, and we found a really unique way to connect those with some new technology and to get data out of that new technology and put it into a form and a function that we can use for making regulatory decisions. It's really cool stuff. And I promise you, we are going to get to all this stuff a little bit later in the presentation. But before we do that, I would be remiss if we didn't slow down just a little bit and push pause for a minute and talk about where we've been with wild turkeys in North Carolina, really over most of the last century. Talk about the history of wild turkey management. And I'm just going to touch on the highlights today. But if you're interested in turkeys and wild turkey management at all, you really ought to look up this, essentially a book that's on our internet site that was written by Mike Seamster a number of years ago that compiled just a whole wealth of turkey related information specific here to North Carolina. It's a tremendously good resource. And one of the things you're going to see in that document is you're going to find out that the picture for turkeys in the mid 1900s was pretty bleak. Populations were extirpated from the vast majority of the state. It was not a good picture. And so at this point, I'm going to push pause even again, and I'm going to actually ask the first of two pop quiz questions. I mentioned this to David Cobb earlier. He didn't know it was coming, but I'm going to ask you the question right now, and you can put your answer in the chat. And I guess if you're the first person to get your answer in the chat, you've got bragging rights over everybody else. So the question is, what year was the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission established? And just as a hint, even though I've got a 1948 wild turkey distribution map up here, that may or may not be the correct year. But anyway, so the situation in the late 1940s.
Hey, Chris, just since you asked, Forrest Orr was the first person to put the correct answer in.
Okay, very good. He's got bragging rights, but everybody else, you got one more opportunity. So that's coming up shortly. All right, so the picture was bleak in 1948. A few years later, when they did this the second time in the 1950s, the situation was not much better for turkeys. But that wasn't for lack of wanting more turkeys or for hard work. The reality is that there was some trap and transfer type work going on then. I think 1953 was the first year any birds were trapped and transferred within the state. We had turkey refuges established around the state. They were intended to function much like the bear sanctuaries that we have that have been so successful for bears. But quite frankly, progress and restoration was just exceedingly slow and difficult. If we jump forward to 1970, there's two really worthy things that happened that year that I want to mention. And the first one is a really bad one. So in 1970, our staff estimated the statewide turkey population to be only 2,000 turkeys. That's really, that's the bad point. That's our low point for wild turkeys in the state. The really good thing that happened in 1970 is that the Wildlife Commission had the good fortune to hire Wayne Bailey as the WRC's full-time turkey project leader. And so Wayne Bailey was coming to the agency after a long and distinguished career as a turkey biologist in West Virginia. And so he was top of his game, basically. And it took somebody like that, along with the hard work of our staff, to make some pretty radical changes in our restoration program and to lead that program. And the first piece of that restoration work that was so instrumental to getting us on the path to success was to essentially change the culture of turkey hunting in the state. Historically, we had fall hunting seasons, and historically those seasons were allowed either sex of birds to be taken, and the bag limits were relatively liberal. And that really decimated the population. That, along with large scale changes in habitat, decimated the population. So Wayne Bailey and his colleagues at the time were instrumental in getting what was really a very unpopular decision to close those fall hunting seasons and shift to a more conservative male only spring hunting season. So that was one piece of the puzzle. The other piece was the trap and relocation work that was done, not just in North Carolina, but within lots of states. And the thinking behind that is, or the logic behind it is, we had extirpated turkeys from lots of places where the habitat was quite good. So it was a relatively straightforward matter to catch birds from those few remaining areas where they existed and release them into areas of good habitat and let them do their own thing. And that actually worked really, really good for turkeys. And through the course of time, over the next several decades, we released more than 6,000 turkeys to 358 restoration sites around the state. So that brings us to our second pop quiz question. And I would say this one is a little bit more difficult than the first one. But all of those 6,000 and some odd turkeys that were released on restoration sites in North Carolina, how many of those came from outside of North Carolina? So how many of them came from other states? And the reason I make that point is this wasn't strictly an internal effort within North Carolina. We got a lot of help from other states, and we got a lot of help from the National Wild Turkey Federation in allowing those birds to be trapped and moved across straight lines and released in places where the habitat was good. So really monumental success story. I'm really just touching the highlights, but it brings us to the point of where we are today in thinking about turkey populations. And today, when we did our look at our most recent turkey range map or turkey density map that we updated last year, we find that pretty much every county in the state's got a robust turkey population. And our statewide population now, we estimate, is in the neighborhood of 270,000 turkeys statewide. So we went from roughly 2,000 to now 270,000. That's a pretty monumental change in the population. And that has fostered really dramatic increases in wild turkey harvest over the years. So now we're getting down to the management side of things, regulatory management today. And when we look at wild turkey harvest over the last 50 years, basically 40 to 50 years, we look here at 1977. That's the first year we had mandatory reported harvest in North Carolina. And we see for, a decade or so, there was very few wild turkeys being harvested. But nowadays we're up in the neighborhood of 20,000 birds in each of the last few years being in our legal reported harvest every spring. So that's a tremendous success story. I want you to kind of know some of those high points of our history, but I don't want you to get the mistaken impression that everything is rosy with wild turkeys, either in North Carolina or in other states. We actually see a handful of counties within the state where we've seen some pretty substantial declines, both in the population and in reported harvest. If we look to Allegheny County, in particular, we see that peak harvest and probably peak populations were right around the 2001 mark. And currently that population is down considerably there. It's still a pretty robust harvest, but not what it used to be. So we do have questions about what's going on with turkeys. We have questions about how to better manage them. And that brings us to really sort of a central question is what actually is our goal for wild turkey management? Our Board of Commissioners accepted a goal statement or adopted a goal statement back in 2006 as part of an intensive look at turkeys in the state. And this is what they came up with. This is our adopted goal for wild turkey management. The point being with this goal statement is that that's adopted by the commission, and it really is. It's looking at hunting quality as well as raw numbers of turkeys that might be taken. So then the logical question that follows from that is, well, how do we do that with our regulations? And the graph that you're seeing now, this one titled Gobbling Activity, I sat down and sketched this out back in 2015 based on what at that point we knew from a lot of years of research through the 1970s and 80s, not research projects in North Carolina, but other parts of the Southeast. And what we thought we knew was that there was two clear major peaks in gobbling activity in the springtime. And this graph is theoretical, it's not data driven, but it's built from data driven projects. And so what we felt like the appropriate way to manage turkeys and have hunting seasons was for turkey harvest to happen here during the second peak in gobbling, which really you might even expect that to be the larger of the two peaks. And the reason is that, we've moved to spring hunting, which is more conservative to allow populations to grow. And when you think about underlying biology of turkeys, there's some danger points there. We're talking about hunting a ground nesting bird during the breeding season. That's inherently got some pitfalls there. But when we look at turkey biology, we also realize that the only contribution that males make, or that the toms and gobblers make, is breeding the hens. So unlike a lot of other game birds or songbirds, the males don't build the nest, they don't incubate the eggs, they don't rear the young in any way. So from a management standpoint, once the actual breeding is done, and you're over here during this second peak and hens are incubating nests, then those males are largely surplus to the population. So that's the concept that we have always based our regulations on for a lot of years, and not just us. That's not inherent just to North Carolina. That's kind of inherent to a lot of turkey management across the country. And that brings us then to our age-old question. Is our turkey season at the right time of year? So we're not really talking big calendar changes like fall to spring, but we're talking about within the spring. Do we have this timed right, given all the intense pressure that we put on that population every spring? Is our turkey season at the right time of year? And the cool part of that question now is that we have some really neat equipment and technology that can help us answer that question. So acoustic recorders are not really new. That's a little bit of a misstatement. They're sort of new to my experience, and they're new to a lot of different applications within wildlife work. They're a lot like a trail camera. Folks are pretty familiar with trail cameras, but some major differences there. So you've got external microphones here, so it's recording audio files instead of taking pictures. Highly programmable. You can tell it when to turn itself on and off every day on whatever schedule you want. And then you have that audio file to do with as you want. You can listen for whatever type animal or sounds you might think is on there. And I remember sitting down in David Cobb's office back in the fall of 2015 and talking about this kind of equipment. David was our wildlife division chief at that point. And we talked about, what do we know about turkeys? We're getting a lot of scrutiny to change seasons, in particular make seasons earlier in the southeastern part of the state. And we had a real frank discussion about what we do, what we know, what we don't know, and what kind of things we might be able to learn from acoustic recorders. And really this second objective that I've listed here for this project is the primary. That's our real thing of interest. We wanted to be able to use acoustic recorders to help evaluate our spring hunting seasons and the timing of it. But in order to do that, we recognize that, this equipment's been around a while. It's been used for other species, but we need to make sure that we've got the best method for using those, in particular this automated processing, that we're not being misled by the equipment at all. And we recognize that, if we're going to answer these questions, we've got to have some of this data being collected, or these recorders being used in the mountains. We're going to also have some down in the southeastern part of the state in entirely different habitats, entirely different part of the state. If we're going to capture the entire breeding season for turkeys, we've got to be thinking about putting those recorders out in late February when there's snow on the ground, and really having them collect and operate all the way through late May into June, perhaps. So we knew that was part of the question. And in particular, we also understood that, if we put that unit up at, like this one in the photo here in Allegheny County, it's on one of the state park tracks up there, that the acoustic environment there before and after green up potentially is quite different. If you talk to pretty much any turkey hunter, they'll talk about the effect of green up on their ability to hear a turkey. And so that was one of the driving questions that we had in terms of using this type of equipment. So specifically, when we get down to that first objective that I listed there, how do we best use acoustic recorders? I refer to what we did as we extensively tested these things in the field. And when I say we tested them in the field, what I'm talking about is we took, this is me on the right here, but we took a Fox Pro speaker and we played gobbles through it, lots of gobbles, thousands and thousands of gobbles. And we did that in a real systematic fashion where we were a known distance away from a recorder. And we also, in most cases, had a person standing there also listening at the tree or at the unit. You can kind of get an idea of this. We weren't playing them necessarily from as close in this picture, but we would progressively go farther and farther away. And in fact, when we tested this equipment, we tested everywhere from 50 meters away from the recorder all the way out to 300 meters away from the recorder. We played those gobbles through an external speaker. And then when you look at that data recorded, we categorized lots and lots of things about the sites that we were interested in. I sort of touched on the region of the state or the habitat type that we were in, forest type. And of course, there's also things like wind and background noise as well. And very importantly, we also categorized the green up, basically as before or after green up. So we did some of these tests in late wintertime when the trees were completely bare. And then we came back to those same sites in the springtime, or excuse me, in the early summertime after the site was fully greened up or fully leafed out to see what the difference in detecting gobbles was. And so for each one of those tests, down here at the bottom, you see that there's three things listed that we're able to determine. So the human observer in the field, that's pretty easy to understand. And that's what Kimberly Smith is doing there. She's simply making a note of every gobble that she hears with her ear played. The second thing is pretty straightforward as well. So this was me, I'm a human. And when I take that recorder back to the office and I sit down and listen to it, how many gobbles can I detect or can I hear just simply listening to it real time? And it's a very high quality recording. But the most important thing really is this third caveat or third point that I've listed down here. The true power of acoustic recorders is when you have a software driven process that can go through thousands and thousands of recordings, hours of recordings efficiently. So that's what we really wanted to understand, was that automated software detection process. And in our work, the program that we used to do that software detection was called Raven Pro. A lot of different folks have used that in wildlife applications, and it's a cool project. I won't take the time to get too far into the details of it today, but I do want to kind of walk you through an example to give you an understanding of how it works. It's sort of a two-part process. You load one of the recordings, one of the audio recordings into Raven Pro, and this is the window you get. This is the picture you work from. So yes, you can hear the sound, but you also get this spectrogram picture. They call it a spectrogram. And basically any sound in the forest or in the recording is going to show up as, and here's a really technical term, it's going to show up as an identifiable black squiggle. That's kind of the way I think about it. But you begin to see these patterns in the data. and you recognize that what the spectrogram is telling you is this is frequency going up on the left, and this is time on your horizontal axis. This is about a 30-second segment or snapshot of a single recording. So that's the bird songs that were happening over a 30-second recording from one of our units. And you start to recognize the different shapes pretty quick. So one like that jumps out real quick. You listen to it a time or two and you realize, well, this is an American robin singing. And you realize, well, that matches up with a higher frequency than a turkey gobble. So we know that's not our animal of interest. And we know we need to be looking for turkey gobbles down in this 750 kilohertz type range. And so that's where we program the software to look for sounds that are the right amount of time, the right frequency, the right dynamics of what we think a turkey gobble looks like. So the software makes the first pass and it flags all these spots in the recordings. And then we have a person, a human, that goes through and looks at and listens to, as necessary, each one of those detections to figure out which ones are turkeys and which ones are not. And in this example, one of those four that was flagged in this little section was actually a turkey gobble. It's that one right there. The other three, not surprisingly, are woodpeckers. That's a real commonly sounding thing out in the woods, and oftentimes that would trigger the software as well. So we would refer to this gobble, kind of getting down into the nuances of the terminology. So this would be referred to as a true positive. In other words, it found a real gobble. The woodpeckers that were flagged, those will be referred to as false positives. And then there's one more aspect here, and that is that there's actually three other gobbles in that section of time that were not detected by the software, but that you could hear with your natural ear listening to the recording. So those would be those three gobbles. That probably was a bird that was much farther away. But those three gobbles we would refer to as false negatives. So in other words, there really was a gobble there, but software missed it. So that's kind of the process. What I want you to know is it's a two-step process. With the first step is the software, computer aided, and the second step is verifying that or validating it by a person. Okay, that's how that process works. Now, when we look at the results of the field tests that we did, this is really interesting. This is cool. I have not seen these type data published or presented anywhere else by any other projects. So I told you in our field testing, we had three different ways that we were counting the number of gobbles. So what Kimberly Smith was doing there, that's the green line. That's the field observer standing there. And not surprisingly, at 50 meters away, that number is really close to perfect. It's really close to 100% detection. And then that begins to fall off, as you get out here to 300 meters or so. The manual review, that's listening to the recording in the office, basically, just with a slip-on pair of headphones and listen to the picture and look at the spectrogram. And that's pretty comparable in terms of the performance of that. It's not that far off from the field observer. This line down here at the bottom is the one that we're really interested in. That's the automatic detection. That's the software aided detection process that I just told you about. So a couple things jump out right off the page. Number one, the software is not going to find all the gobbles that are in that sound file. But that's okay, because you're trying to balance in setting the parameters of what you're telling it to look for. You're trying to balance out false positives and false negatives. You're trying to get as clean of a data set as you can. So that's not too surprising. But what you see is it falls off pretty quickly once you get past 50 or 100 meters. And when you get out to about 300 meters away from a recorder, there's very little chance that software is going to automatically detect a turkey gobble. So that's really interesting to know. It really helps us think about how to place these and how to use those data. Another piece of information that came from testing the equipment, I found this to be fascinating. And that's looking more specifically at the effect of green up. Now, this is a subset of our data that I pulled out because I wanted to show you what I'm doing here. That's why the graph looks a little different. But what you're looking at here is the subset that is specific to evaluating leaf off conditions. So basically the black bars are late winter as compared to leaf on conditions. That's basically the summertime or late spring conditions. And what you see is when you look at these first couple of distance bands, so when you're only 50 meters away from the recorder, the software actually does a little bit better with the leaves on the trees. You actually see that in those first two distance bands. But once you get out here to 150 or 200 or out toward 300 meters, the software does a little better when the leaves are off the trees. And I think that has to do with the amount of volume that we specified the equipment to look at. You know, it's maybe a little overwhelmed when those no leaves to sort of muffle the sound a little bit. Now, you might guess that these just cancel each other out and the overall effect is a wash, but actually that's not the case. Because you got to think about the sampling area around that recorder is a circle, and there is far less area that's right here at 50 or 100 meters that's close to the recorder as compared to the amount of distance or the number of acres or the likelihood that a turkey would be out here at 200 or 250 meters away. So the fact that this is representing a broader area out here outweighs the fact that when you're up close, the software does a little better. So we found that result to be kind of surprising, quite frankly. Not that GreenUp had an effect, but that it had this really kind of interesting effect in the software. So really cool stuff. The other things, I'll show you this slide again. So all the other things that we kind of recorded and analyzed in our review, yes, some of those had an effect, such as topographical interference or wind, background noise, but they weren't really big surprises. And compared to distance and GreenUp, they didn't have a major effect on the utility of the equipment. So that was really good to know. So from that standpoint of our project, we felt like we had a really good handle on how to best use that type of equipment. And that really served as the launching point for understanding what we were doing in achieving the second objective, which was to collect enough data and run it through a software program that would allow us to evaluate our spring hunting seasons. And we in fact did that. We went out and bought 51 of these recorders, and we deployed those each year from March through May of 2016 through 2019. Each one of those units was programmed to come on for 2.5 hours every day, starting right before sunrise. And we moved them around a little bit from one year to the next. So in total, we ended up using 94 locations across 60 properties in 41 counties. I'll show you the map here in just a second. But I also want to drill down on this last point here in that we went to properties that did not have a lot of hunting pressure, turkey hunting pressure on them. And there was a logical reason for that. Our ideal properties, our field staff work to put these up was to find large properties that had lots of turkeys that had little to no hunting pressure. And we did not want our understanding of gobbling chronology to be confounded by hunting pressure. Anybody here on the meeting today that's been to one of Deep James's seminars about turkey hunting, Deep does a good job of making the point that dead turkeys don't gobble. And the ones that are pressured, they don't gobble as much as they would if they weren't pressured. So we didn't want that confounding factor in our understanding of gobbling chronology. And we deployed those units all across the state, like I say, over a 4-year period. There was some movement around. We don't have to get into the details of which ones were where in this presentation, but I feel very comfortable that I feel comfortable in saying that if there were some major regional differences in gobbling chronology, either east-west, north to south, anything like that, we would be able to pick those up. And the reason I'm kind of touching on that is, one of the primary questions that we get from hunters and the public oftentimes is that southeastern North Carolina is got gobbling chronology that happens earlier than other parts of the state. For example, are turkeys down here gobbling and breeding earlier than turkeys up here in the northwestern part of the state, for example? That was a primary driver for what we wanted to understand. And we collected with that equipment a tremendous data set. And don't get too overwhelmed by the numbers here, but look down to the bottom line. I'll point out a couple of highlights here. So in total, over the 4 years, it's almost 54,000 hours of recordings that we had. And from those recordings, the Raven Pro software helped us find almost 114,000 gobbles. That's a really good data set to be able to look at regional or district driven differences and really get down into small scale, excuse me, not small scale, but really refined or nuanced differences in gobbling chronology. When I talked about that earlier graph that I put together, those studies in the 70s and 80s, those were very small scale studies that maybe worked with at best a few hundred or possibly even a few thousand gobbles. So this equipment today gives us a sample size power that was not there before. The other thing that's interesting on this map, and I tallied this on here as well. So based on our understanding of the equipment, our best estimate is that there's about another 14,000 gobbles or so that we probably missed that are not on those recordings due to the effect of green up. And if you kind of look at the numbers, you'll see that that's not consistent across the regions. You know, the number of gobbles missed in the mountains is a much lower percentage than the number of gobbles that we missed in the coastal plain. And that's not real surprising. Green up happens from southeast to northwest generally. So it's not surprising that the difference had that shift to it. So, you know, I've mentioned this graph a couple times. This is what we thought we used to know. And so the really interesting thing that Dr. Cobb and others and I wanted to look at was, is this in fact how it plays out? So let's look at that. And I think the short answer is no. It actually doesn't play out like that. We don't see two really prominent peaks in our data. And this first graph I'm showing you here, this is essentially getting kind of close to raw data. So this is just simply the number of gobbles that we detected broken out by week. So I pulled these data into weeks. So the first week here is first week of March, and the 13th week is the last week of May. And then that's the black bar is simply the number of gobbles that we detected. There's no other analysis or anything done on that black bar. Added to the top of that, just for perspective, is the number of gobbles that we figure we probably missed due to green up. And when we looked at this graph, when we start seeing our preliminary data coming in and stuff, we realized pretty quickly that it doesn't conform to what we thought we knew about wild turkey gobbling. And that was a surprise some, but not a surprise to everybody. We also quickly recognized that we needed a bit more rigorous analysis of those data. And we were really fortunate to get some great assistance from a couple folks over at NC State University to help us do that. And these next couple graphs are looking at the more rigorous analysis that they helped us with. And the broad term for the analysis that we did there was kernel density estimates. The really good thing about that is it's looking more holistically at those data. And it's not only combining the gobbling, so the gobbling information that was on that previous graph, it takes that and it also combines it with our understanding of how those acoustic recorders perform. So in other words, it takes into account the green up factor. It takes into account the other smaller influences of region and forest type and vegetation and those kind of things. And that really gives us what we think is a much better picture of the gobbling trend. And when we look at here at the top of the graph, at that statewide graph, what we see is that shaded section in the middle, I need to mention that. So that represents the time at which our hunting seasons occur in North Carolina. That's the 5-week period, basically from early April through early May, where hunting can occur. Now, again, this work was done on properties where birds were, for the most part, not hunted. So when we look at something like this that shows the majority of gobbling activity happened during the time at which the hunting season can occur, that's a real communication piece for talking to hunters who maybe are experiencing something where they see the vast majority or hear the vast majority of gobbling happening over here pre-season, and then because birds are. Okay, so are you seeing my presentation now, Dan?
Yeah, it's up now.
Okay, so I'm not sure exactly where y'all lost me, but the key things I'm trying to point out is that during this period in the middle that's shaded, where our turkey season, hunting season occurs, we see lots of gobbling activity going on. The other key thing that we're seeing here on this map is that when we look regionally, we don't see drastic differences in how that gobbling chronology plays out from east to west across the state. So Coast Piedmont and Mountains, pretty similar trends in how gobbling chronology plays out. That's really interesting. Where we did see a lot of variation in gobbling chronology was year to year differences. So when we looked across the 4 years, combining all the information together, we actually did see that gobbling activity from one year to the next showed a lot of variation. You see that the shaded portion here in 2017 is a little different than the other couple of years, and that's because our season structure shifts around. And on this graph, we can actually show that specific to where it was. It's triggered by calendar dates, not, excuse me, calendar dates shift a little bit from one year to the next. So when we get down to the very last slide here, I would say this was, if you could only see one slide from this entire presentation, this is the one I would want you to pay most attention to. And these really are the three key findings of all this work that we did. Number one, we saw very little regional variation in gobbling activity. And that leads us to say that maintaining a single uniform hunting season across the state is entirely appropriate. Number two, we found that the majority of gobbling activity happens right there in that April through early May time period when we have our hunting season. But at the same time, we recognize that that may be quite different than what hunters experience where birds are being hunted. So educating hunters and helping them to understand the biology is important. Simply shifting the season won't necessarily result in them hearing more gobbling activity, because whenever you hunt them, they're going to gobble less. And then the third point down there is getting at how much breeding and gobbling is going on before the season, and is our season structure such that we are allowing adequate time for hens to be bred and to get onto the nest, safely incubated nests, before we open. And this doesn't really answer that question, but we suspect that this is pretty strong support for saying don't open the season any earlier. And ideally, some of the information that's coming from other research projects that we have going now, looking at nesting chronology, is the way to answer that question more fully. You don't, I'm in a good position today to get to present these results to you. But I'm kind of like a proverbial turtle on a fence post. When you see me, you know I didn't get there by myself, and this project's no different. I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of different folks involved. In particular, I'm going to point out that the North Carolina chapter of the National Wild Turkey Federation, they ponied up in excess of $50,000 for us to do this work. We're very appreciative of it. I mentioned that Dr. Pacifica and Dr. Pease there at NC State were really helpful in the data analysis portion of this. And then there's no shortage of field staff and administrative staff that helped us make this happen in the field. My hat's off to all those folks for the hard work they did to get us to this point. The last slide I have, Dr. Cobb, before I turn it over to you, is just to point out that I'm just hitting the highlights today. And if you're interested in the details, in addition to asking me questions, you can certainly look up this final report that's available on our intranet, and it's available to the public as well. So it's right there on the internet as well. I'd encourage you to look at it if you're interested. With that, I hope y'all can still hear me, and I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Cobb, if you want to do questions.
All right, that's great. Thanks, Chris. Great presentation of a very important, very well conducted project. I will ask everybody to put your questions in the chat. And I guess, Chris, maybe I'll get it started by just asking you if you would explain to the group. You touched on the gobbling chronology, the nesting chronology work that's being done now. Can you just briefly explain to everybody how that project connects to this project that you led, and then the potential use of that information within the context of the agency?
Yeah, I can certainly speak to that. I will point out that that's a pretty big ask because you're touching on some pretty big topics. But in considering hunting regulations and season timing. I mean, there's two big pieces to that. There's hunter satisfaction, and there's also the conservation of the resource, or the wise use of the resource. So gobbling chronology obviously is a huge piece of the hunter satisfaction side, and it does give you a glimpse into the reproductive side as well. So that's a logical first step and an important first step to look at. The more difficult step to look at is nesting chronology and actually measuring through radio telemetry what the specific dates at which those hens are incubating nests, and they have been bred and they are safely able to reproduce. So the work we're doing now, so this work was 4 years from 2016 to 2019. In 2020, we actually launched a very ambitious project with NC State where we're actually doing field-based telemetry, catching birds, catching hens in particular, and monitoring them during the nesting season to answer those specific pieces of the equation. Is that getting at what you're wanting, Dave?
Yep, that gets to what I wanted, and you very artfully avoided the discussion of the commission and potential regulatory issues, and I don't blame you. So if anybody has any questions, put them in the chat. I'm going to go back to your pop quiz because we only dealt with one of those. Forrest Orr was the first person to put 1947. I will let you answer your own second question because honestly, I don't recall the exact number and I didn't jump off to go look it up. So how many turkeys were brought in from out of state?
1,985. That makes winner Mr. Ken Knight. And I'm sure Ken knew that number off the top of his head, and he didn't probably look it up in his copy of the history document.
Well, and I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, although I will just point out that I've been monitoring the chat the whole time, and I'll leave it at that. Okay, so Forrest and Ken wins the pop quiz. I don't know what you're giving them, Chris. You'll have to decide that.
They get the satisfaction of knowing they won the pop quiz.
There you go. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, Chris. So I guess we'll wrap it up. I will just say again, great presentation on a really groundbreaking foundational project, and I appreciate you giving the presentation. And I'll just echo what you said. I appreciate everybody that had a hand in the project. Many of those folks have been on the listening to you today. And a lot of them haven't, but it's like you said, all the really great work we do as an agency, we do collectively with a lot of partners, and I appreciate you pointing that out. And I hope everybody will come back on the second Tuesday at 11 o'clock. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. I enjoyed it.